Welcome back to the snow. We're going to continue talking about techniques for snow travel, and today I'm going to talk about techniques for snow travel without an ice axe. And to be honest, unless I'm out specifically on a mountaineering trip, even if I know there's snow, it's very, very rare that I'll bring an ice axe with me unless I've been told by someone that there's really hard conditions. There's a particular maybe avalanche slope that a trail crosses that I know where an ice axe can be really helpful. But I'll also talk at the end of this about a technique that you can use without an ice axe for even hard snow slopes if you're willing to take a little risk. So this is a really good thing to practice in general for mountaineering as well, which is the ability to walk up steep snow in boots with no balance tool. So without a pole, like a ski pole, and without an ice axe. It's going to teach you how to keep your balance over your feet. So first, the stiffer the boot you have, the better tool you have for impacting the snow and creating a good step. So having an alpine boot, a dedicated alpine boot with a completely rigid snow that can also climb ice is probably going to be the best tool. Those boots tend to have toe welts for attachment of full automatic crampons. Today I have sort of a hybrid boot that climbs rock really well. It has a heel welt for attaching semi-automatic crampons, but it doesn't have a toe welt here. Okay, so these boots tend not to be quite as rigid, but for my purposes in this type of snow and for most of my guiding below 10,000 feet, I'll use these because they're light, they're flexible, and they're plenty rigid for kicking steps in snow. So anytime you are kicking in snow, ultimately what you're trying to do is create a slightly in-cut platform with your boot. So this slope that we have here to play with isn't awesome for demonstrating this. It's not nearly as steep of a snow slope as I'd like to show you guys, but we've got COVID going on right now. I don't want to go into any lands that aren't open, and there's not that much snow. It's getting into late May. So we're going to do what we can with the slope that we've got, right? So kicking a platform that's slightly in-cut means I'm going to kick my boot in, and when I kick my boot in, instead of having the platform that I've created being perpendicular to the skyline, I'm going to have it slightly angled into the slope. So should I slip or stumble, I fall into the slope. So you can see here when I kick, there's a slight tilt, cock to my ankle that makes that slope inward. If I were the second climber in a rope team, or if I were the second hiker coming up this slope, then when I encounter that slope, I want to improve that step. So when I step in that, I don't want to just simply put my foot in it and go on up and put my foot in the next one. Although that might be very little energy for me, it could deform the step over time and gradually shape this step so it slopes outward, especially if this step sees some sun. So I want to improve that step by doing the same thing, kicking into it at the same angle, so by the end person on my rope team reaching this step, it's really in perfect shape, it's nice and deep into the snowpack, and it pulls them into the slope, so they're less likely to slip out of it than even I was. Okay, the first technique that I'm going to demonstrate, I'm just going to call it walking. And the reason that I'm going to call it walking is because essentially it's just walking up the snow slope. And to be honest, for, I don't know, I'll take a random percentage, maybe 70% of the guiding that I do in snow terrain, I am simply walking. And that's because there's a trail in place. The routes that I'm guiding are done by lots of recreational climbers as well as other guided parties. And there's no need for me to use special footwork. Special footwork is great in steep terrain where you're impacting the slope in a new way to put in new steps, but otherwise it can actually be kind of tiring. So when you're walking on snow, really the only thing that you need to keep in mind is where is your center of gravity? It's common for people who've never encountered snow before to treat the snow as something scary and dangerous, and that if you slip, you're going to slide to the bottom of the mountain. You know, we hear a lot of stories like that. So if you haven't walked on snow very much before, it's a good idea to go out to a nice easy snow slope, get to a position where you feel comfortable that if you fall, there's nothing that bad that's going to happen, and just practice walking. Don't try to do anything special, and just feel the way the snow slides around. And you can see, even without kicking, the slope might collapse a little bit as I walk, but I can control my slide a little bit by gradually lowering my toes down into the slope, and that can allow me to slide down okay? Or by levering my heels back, that acts like a brake, almost kind of like you're on rollerblades. So get comfortable with that. Once you're comfortable with that, then practice dropping only the weight of your leg into the slope, just a little bit, okay? So you can see I lift my leg up, and it's a lazy person's walk, okay? I just drop my foot down and walk up and down the slope, not trying to do any particular technique. This next technique that I'm going to show is a different type of walking on snow, and we're going to use a little bit more precision with our footwork. This technique I've heard called the American technique because it makes you ride like a cowboy, okay? And it could also be called the duck technique. In fact, in French, it's called pied en canard. I can't speak French, so you'll have to judge my accent harshly. But it's essentially a duck walk, or a walk where your feet, instead of being parallel the way they are when you're walking normally, you point your toes to the outside with your heels closer together than they at the back here, okay, as you're walking. So this is a really low angle slope. So when I do this, I'm not going to have to flay my feet out or splay my feet out that far. The steeper the slope is, the further out you're going to want to turn your toes. Now this particular technique is very useful when you have a really large backpack, where doing some of the other techniques that require crossing over might be a little bit more difficult or a little less balanced. Or in particular, if you're doing a peak like Denali and you have a sled, then some of those cross-stepping techniques become even more difficult because you have things hanging off the back. So you might need to use this even more. So if you do have plans on doing Denali in the future, good idea to get out there with a giant pack, a sled, some steep slopes, and practice this duck walk. So I'm going to turn into the slope, and you'll notice my feet are splayed out, just like so, okay? And now when I walk up, what I think about, if the slope is really steep, is I think about my knees, and I think about an arrow being drawn from the inside of my knee into the slope, right here. So I'm going to continue to face that arrow into the slope. Once I start going like this and my knee comes here, then those arrows are going to point in toward themselves, okay? And you can see I'm trying to use simply the weight of my leg as I go. If the slope becomes harder or firmer, then I may need to kick a little bit. And again, I'm being very particular in trying to in-cut those steps for the person or people coming behind me. On to true technique numero dos, number 2. So this technique we're going to do is commonly called French technique, or pied à plat. Or the flat-footed technique. You're crossing your feet over each other as you go. And there's a couple small things that make this technique a little easier. So first, let's take a look at it. Place my foot, again, I'm cutting into the slope whenever possible. And then I place my next foot up and over. Now, during this point, a lot of people will feel a little imbalanced as they come out and around. So what I recommend is you squeeze your thighs together. And by squeezing your thighs together, for those of you who have done yoga, like tree pose and things like that, you know balancing on one foot can feel a little precarious, but once you touch your other leg, it adds a little stability. I have no idea why. Okay, but you're going to pass it over and then squeeze those thighs together a little bit. Okay? And then step up and up and up and up. So this is the correct way to do this, where every step you're gaining just a few inches. I'm going to demonstrate 2 common mistakes that I see when doing this cross step, the French technique. So here's the first. So here I have made really large steps, which increases the force that I need to produce with my quad, especially if I have a big backpack on, and increases the likelihood that I'm going to lose my balance and fall down the slope. So having nice small steps is really key here for maintaining your balance and making sure you don't get worn out. The second mistake that I commonly see is this one. And this is a little more subtle and difficult to see, But essentially what's happening is I'm taking a step up with my left foot, and then my right foot is going either parallel with it, which is a really imbalanced position right here where I can fall over easily, or may not even be stepping up quite as high. So I'm doing most of the lifting with my uphill leg. So over time, this left leg is going to get really tired, and I'm not going to advance up the slope as quickly as if this leg passes over 4 inches, this one steps up 4 inches, and so on and so forth. So try to make those steps even. One of the great advantages of this cross step is I work different muscle groups. My left leg is working sort of the vastus medialis, this inside muscle here, and my right leg is working more the lateralis and up into the glute. So I'm developing different muscles at different times, and by doing this, this will carry me up a slope diagonally, and then when I switch sides, it's going to carry me up diagonally the other direction. So that would produce a straight line if you average those two out. Or you could diagonally cut a slope, which is really common when you're climbing. So I'll show how to switch sides really quick. You'll notice when I switch sides in this cross step, I come into a position that we've already covered. We come into the duck position. So when I cross here, this right foot is going to stay with my hip open, and then my left foot comes up and opens up in that duck technique, and now I'm on the other side. Same thing here. So typically, you'll travel up, maybe a minimum of 10 meters, a minimum of 30 feet before you'd switch, but more commonly you're going something like 40, 50, 60 meters up before you make a switch back. Just like when you're hiking on a trail and you see their switchbacks are quite long, that makes this much easier as you ascend the slope. We're going to take a look at technique number 3, which ironically in French is called the third technique, troisième. There's my terrible French accent again, okay? So the third way, or here in the United States, we typically call it hybrid method. In the hybrid method, we are going to use a step directly into the slope where I kick straight in, okay? And this step here too, we haven't covered it yet, but I'll cover it as part of this hybrid technique. I'm gonna bring my heel up toward my butt and simply let my hip swing and come into the slope, trying not to add any unnecessary tension in that leg. Because if you have to do this a long distance, it's going to become really tiring. So once again, I bring the heel to my butt. I can cock my knee back a little bit if I need that much force, and I swing from my hips and my abs, not from these muscles on the front of my thigh. Okay, so this would be kicking straight into the slope. And sometimes I hear people calling this making little mailboxes or pigeonholes in, where each of those steps slopes in. So it's going straight up, oftentimes for short sections of steep slopes. That's helpful, but your calves are going to get tired. So the third technique, the middle way, the hybrid technique, you go straight in with one foot, and then with your other foot, you're going to come back out into that duck technique here. And that provides a lot more stability and rest for the calf of the leg that's doing that duck technique. And just like before when we were doing the cross step, when one leg gets tired using one group of muscles, you simply switch. So the other foot is splayed out in duck, and the original one is doing the pigeonhole technique. The last technique that I want to talk about for moving on snow without an ice axe is called the plunge step. Now it's called the plunge step because you're supposed to plunge your boot down and into the snow. This is a technique for descending soft snow. It does not work on hard snow. It certainly does not work on ice. So make sure you keep it in context and beware, because if you're descending a slope with soft snow and it's sunny, warm day, but the night before it was cold, and you pass into shadow, you pass into the shade, and it's stayed in the shade since early morning, then the snow in that spot could be really hard, and when you try to plunge, you could slip and fall. So I'm going to demonstrate without an ice axe because it's good practice, but this technique especially is usually better with an ice axe or some form of support like a trekking pole at the very least, so that if you start to lose your balance you can regain it, and if you have an axe you can actually self-arrest. Okay? So one of the common mistakes that I see with the plunge step is people trying to lower themselves on their balancing leg. This is not only tiring because you're eccentrically contracting your quadricep muscles, but it's also less effective because you're transferring your load gradually from one foot to the other and not impacting and penetrating the snowpack. So one good way to practice for the plunge step, I find, is simply to run downhill. So I'm going to practice that now. By running, what I'm doing is I'm transferring my weight 100% from one leg to the other, which means all of my weight impacts the snow all at once. The only thing that I change about my running form is I flex my toes back toward my knee, so I'm tensing up this muscle here, the tibialis anterior, keeping that flexed so I land firmly on my heel each time. When I slow this technique down into a walk, there's still a slight jump in between, so it's almost more like running where you're really only on one foot at a time. So here I'll do the plunge step much more slowly. So hopefully you could see in that I'm transferring my load from one foot to the other by literally pulling one foot out and jumping from one heel to the next. A run is nothing more than a jump from one foot to the next, and a plunge step is nothing more than a jump from one heel to the next as you go down, or a full-on run. Make sure not to practice this where there could be hard snow, and try to practice this most effectively where there's new, fresh, soft snow, rather than using an existing boot pack, which not only destroys that nice boot pack for people coming up, but actually makes your descent more difficult because the snow in the boot pack, having already been compressed, can't be recompressed and soften your descent down the mountain using the plunge step technique.